The massive crystal hall stretched out like a frozen ocean under the artificial suns that hung from the ceiling high above, where thousands of different alien beings sat in their assigned sections according to their species and their importance. In the Galaxy Ambassador, Hyun Woo stood at the central speaking platform with his blue-scaled skin gleaming under the bright lights as he looked out at the sea of faces that belonged to creatures from hundreds of different worlds and star systems. Across the known galaxy, his voice carried clearly through the translation devices that every delegate wore so they could understand each other despite speaking completely different languages that had evolved on worlds millions of light years apart from each other. The human section was small and placed far from the center where the most important species usually sat during these big meetings that decided the fate of entire civilizations and trade routes that connected distant parts of the Galaxy. Admiral Ji-won sat quietly in that isolated human area, watching everything with calm eyes that had seen many battles and difficult negotiations. Over the years, she had served as humanity's main representative to the Galactic Federation. She wore her dark blue uniform with simple rank insignia that looked plain compared to the elaborate robes and decorative armor that many other species wore to show their status and power during these formal occasions. Hyun Woo began speaking about the motion that had brought all these different aliens together today in this neutral space station that orbited between 3 different star systems, so no single species could claim they had home field advantage. The Zilithian ambassador's words were carefully chosen to make humans sound dangerous and unpredictable, like wild animals that could not be trusted around civilized beings who had learned to solve their problems through diplomacy instead of violence. He talked about recent conflicts, where human military ships had been involved in fighting against pirates and slavers who had been attacking peaceful trading vessels and civilian colonies in the Outer Rim territories. The way Hyun Woo described these events made it sound like humans had been the aggressors who started fights for no good reason, instead of defenders who had risked their lives to protect innocent people from criminals. Other delegates began standing up to share their own stories about why they thought humans were too violent and primitive to be allowed in civilized space, where proper beings conducted their business according to established rules. Taemin from the Corvani Empire spoke about how human soldiers fought in ways that his people considered brutal and lacking in honor, because they used tactics that prioritized winning over looking good while doing it. The tall, gray alien's voice shook with emotion as he described battles where humans had boarded enemy ships to rescue hostages instead of negotiating for their release. Like civilized people were supposed to do, So Young from the Thrixie Collective made clicking sounds that the translators turned into words about how humans acted on emotion instead of logic when making military decisions that affected entire star systems. Her insect-like appearance made many other species uncomfortable, but her arguments against human behavior resonated with delegates who preferred predictable responses over the chaotic way humans seemed to react to threats. One after another, the speakers painted a picture of humanity as a species that could not control their aggressive instincts, and therefore posed a danger to the peaceful order that the Federation had worked so hard to build. The vote was scheduled to happen after all the major species had a chance to speak their minds about whether humans should be banned from bringing their military vessels into any system under Federation protection. Admiral Ji-won listened to hours of speeches that twisted every human military action into evidence of their unfitness for civilized society, while her own people were not allowed to defend themselves until the very end. When the actual voting began, the results became clear. Very quickly, as species after species cast their votes in favor of the ban, with only a few small nations abstaining or voting against the motion. The final tally showed 847 votes in favor of banning human military vessels from Federation space, with only 12 votes against and 3 abstentions from species that were afraid to take a clear position. As the numbers appeared on the great display screens throughout the hall, many delegates began celebrating like they had just accomplished something important for the good of galactic civilization. Admiral Ji-won watched the celebration with no expression on her weathered face that had seen too many similar situations where fear and prejudice won out over facts and experience. She stood slowly when the council speaker announced that humans would have 5 minutes to respond to the decision that effectively exiled their military from most of known space. The hall grew quiet as she walked to the speaking platform where so many others had condemned her species for crimes they had never committed while ignoring the good they had done. Her voice was calm and steady as she looked out at the hundreds of alien faces that stared back at her with expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to uncomfortable guilt. She told them that they believed they understood humans, but they really had no idea what they were voting against when they chose to ban the one species that had consistently protected others without asking for payment. The delegates who had spoken against humans earlier now avoided making eye contact with her as she continued speaking about how they would learn the truth about humanity when they no longer had human protection. She said they thought human conflicts with raiders and slavers made humans the monsters, but they would discover who the real monsters were when those same criminals realized there would be no more human ships patrolling the space lanes. Her words were met with dismissive sounds from various species who still believed they were making the right choice by removing what they saw as a disruptive influence from their peaceful galaxy. Admiral Jiwan finished her short speech by telling them they would understand their mistake soon. Enough! And then she turned and walked away from the platform without waiting for any response. As she left the Great Hall, the delegates quickly returned to their celebrations and began making plans for how they would divide up the lucrative trade routes that humans could no longer patrol or protect. The Zilithian delegation was already discussing which systems they would take responsibility for, while the Corvani representatives talked about expanding their own patrol schedules to cover areas humans had previously guarded. None of them seemed to realize that they had just removed the only military force in the galaxy that consistently put the safety of civilians above profit margins and political considerations. The Federation's own defense forces were designed more for show than actual combat, while most member species preferred to let others handle the dangerous work of fighting pirates and slavers. Human ships had been doing that dangerous work for decades without asking for special treatment or demanding payment from the people they protected during raids and attacks. Now that protection was gone and the galaxy was about to learn what life looked like without humans standing between innocent civilians and the predators who hunted them. Admiral Jiwan walked through the corridors of the space station toward the docking bay, where her ship waited to take her back to human space beyond the Federation's borders. Behind her, the celebration continued as hundreds of species congratulated themselves on removing what they believed was a threat to galactic peace while actually eliminating their best defense against chaos. The irony was lost on them as they planned their new security arrangements that would prove completely inadequate when tested by real enemies who did not care about diplomatic protocols or civilized behavior. Within months, they would be begging for the very help they had just voted to ban, but by then it might be too late to undo the damage their prejudice and fear had caused. General Kang Min stood in the war room deep inside the military fortress on the Korthak homeworld, studying the holographic displays that showed star maps of Federation territory, with all the shipping lanes and patrol routes marked in different colors. 6 months had passed since the Galactic Federation voted to ban human military vessels from their space, and the effects were already becoming visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. The Korthak were a species that looked like large reptiles walking on 2 legs with thick armored skin and sharp teeth that they showed when they were pleased about something, which happened most often when they were planning attacks. For generations, they had been held back from expanding their territory by a complex web of treaties and the always-present threat that human rapid response fleets would show up within hours if they tried to invade anyone. Now those human ships were gone, and the Federation was scrambling to fill the gaps in their defenses with forces that had never been designed for serious military action against determined enemies. Sub-Commander Da-Un entered the war room carrying data tablets loaded with intelligence reports that their spy networks had been gathering from across Federation space for the past several months. Her scarred snout curved into what other species would recognize as a predatory smile as she began presenting the information that showed just how vulnerable their former enemies had become. The response times for Federation security forces had more than tripled in most sectors because the remaining patrol ships had to cover much larger areas than they were designed for, Zilithian cruisers that used to handle diplomatic missions. And ceremonial duties were now trying to patrol trade routes where they faced real threats from pirates and raiders for the first time. Thrixie defense platforms worked well for protecting asteroid mining operations, but they moved too slowly to respond to attacks on merchant vessels traveling between star systems. Day-Yun showed tactical analyses that proved most Federation member species had military forces designed more for parades and political display than actual combat against enemies, who fought to win. The Korthak had been studying human military tactics for decades, trying to understand why such a relatively small species could project so much power across such vast distances of space. What they learned was that humans built their military around the idea that every soldier and every ship might have to fight alone against superior numbers until reinforcements could arrive. This made human forces incredibly dangerous in small unit actions, but it also meant they were willing to take risks that other species considered insane or suicidal. Federation militaries preferred large formations with complex command structures that looked impressive during reviews, but collapsed quickly when communications were disrupted or commanders were killed. General Kang Min had been planning for this opportunity since the first rumors started about the Federation considering a ban on human military presence in their territory instead of the usual Korthak strategy of slowly expanding their borders one system at a time. Over many years, he proposed something much more ambitious and dangerous. The Vega Corridor was a chain of star systems that connected 12 major Federation worlds and carried more trade traffic than any other route in known space. Controlling that corridor would give the Korthak access to trillions of credits worth of commerce every year and cut off vital supply lines that fed the Federation's core worlds. More importantly, it would prove, too, the galaxy that the Federation could not protect its own territory without human help, which would encourage other aggressive species to start their own expansion campaigns. Day-Yun presented detailed plans for a lightning campaign that would seize control of all the key systems in the corridor before Federation forces could mount any effective resistance. The attack would begin with simultaneous strikes on 6 different targets using battle groups that had been secretly assembled at staging. Areas near the Federation border electronic warfare ships would jam communications between Federation command centers, making it impossible for them to coordinate their response or call for reinforcements from other sectors' Korthak ground forces. Would capture the major space stations and planetary defense centers, while their fleet elements destroyed any ships that tried to escape or bring help. The plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple attack groups, but the Korthak military had been drilling these scenarios for months in preparation for this moment. Intelligence reports showed that Federation commanders were already overwhelmed trying to manage security responsibilities that humans had previously handled. With much smaller forces, ancient rivalries between different species made it difficult for them to work together effectively, especially when they were under pressure from real military threats. Bureaucratic procedures that worked fine during peacetime became major obstacles when quick decisions were needed to respond to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. General Kang Min studied the tactical displays showing Federation patrol schedules and noted how predictable their movements had become, now that they were spread so thin. Human patrols had been deliberately unpredictable, making it impossible for pirates and other enemies to plan attacks around their absence from particular areas. Federation patrols followed rigid schedules that were easy to track and exploit by anyone with decent intelligence-gathering capabilities like the Korthak spy networks. The General's communications officers began sending coded messages to battle group commanders positioned at secret bases throughout Korthak space, telling them to prepare for immediate deployment. Massive dreadnoughts that had been hidden in asteroid fields and remote star systems started moving toward their assigned positions along the Federation border troop transports loaded. With elite Korthak soldiers began final preparations for the ground assault phase of the operation that would capture key installations. Supply ships carrying ammunition and replacement parts took up positions where they could support the battle. Groups during extended combat operations. The Federation's intelligence services had detected some unusual Korthak military activity, but their reports were lost in bureaucratic channels or dismissed by commanders who could not believe anyone would be bold enough to attack Federation territory directly. Those same commanders were busy arguing about jurisdiction and resource allocation instead of preparing for the possibility that their enemies might actually try to exploit the security gap left by banned human forces. General Kang Min knew that speed would be the key to success, because once the Federation realized they were under coordinated attack, they would eventually manage to organize some kind of response. The goal was to present them with a fait accompli where Korthak forces controlled so much territory that any counterattack would be too costly and dangerous for Federation politicians to approve. Dayun's intelligence teams had identified the specific Federation commanders who would be responsible for coordinating any military response, and most of them had never experienced real combat. They were administrators and politicians in military uniforms who had risen through the ranks by avoiding controversial decisions, rather than by demonstrating tactical competence. The few Federation officers who did have combat experience were mostly older veterans who had worked with human forces and understood how much they depended on human support. Without access to human, rapid response capabilities, those experienced officers would be forced to work with whatever forces their own governments could provide. General Kang Min gave the final authorization for the attack to begin and watched as confirmation signals started, coming back from battle group commanders across Korthak space. In less than 72 hours, the galaxy would learn whether the Federation could actually defend itself or if they had just voted away the only thing that kept them safe from their enemies. The general's staff officers made final adjustments to the timing of the attack to ensure maximum surprise and confusion among Federation defenders, as the last preparation orders went out to Korthak forces. General Kang Min allowed himself a moment of satisfaction knowing that soon his species would control the most valuable trade route in Federation space. The humans had called it protection, but the Korthak knew it was really just another form of control that kept other species from reaching their full potential. Now they would show the galaxy what could be accomplished by a species that was not afraid to take what they wanted instead of waiting for permission from bureaucrats and diplomats. The first attacks began exactly at 00:300 Galactic Standard Time, when Korthak battle groups emerged from hyperspace at 6 different Federation systems, simultaneously catching the local defense forces completely off-guard fleet. Admiral Jun Ho commanded the primary assault force from his massive dreadnought Bloodfang as it led the attack on Kepler Station, which controlled access to 3 major shipping lanes in the Vega corridor. The station's automated defense systems activated immediately, but they had been designed to handle small pirate raids, not coordinated military assaults by an entire battle fleet. Korthak electronic warfare ships jammed all communications between the station and Federation command centers, making it impossible for the defenders to call for help or coordinate with other systems under attack. Within the first hour, Federation forces realized they were facing something completely different from the random pirate attacks they had been dealing with since the humans were banned. Zilithian defensive fleets that had been stretched thin across multiple sectors found themselves overwhelmed by Korthak battle groups that used sophisticated tactics designed specifically to exploit Federation weaknesses. Zilithian commanders had experience with diplomatic missions and ceremonial duties, but they had never faced enemy forces that were actually trying to kill them and capture their territory. Their ships were beautiful and impressive looking, but they lacked the heavy armor and weapon systems needed for serious military combat against determined enemies. Thrixie mobile defense platforms moved too slowly to intercept the fast Korthak strike cruisers that hit their targets and disappeared before the defenders could respond effectively. The insect-like Thrixie had built their military around the idea that superior technology would always defeat primitive aggression, but their weapons were designed for precision, not destruction. Korthak plasma cannons had been specifically engineered to punch through the energy shields that Federation species relied on for protection instead of heavy physical armor. Commander Young Sik tried to coordinate the defense from his command post on Nexus Prime, but the communication breakdowns made it impossible to get accurate information about what was happening. Reports came in from different systems showing that Federation forces were being systematically destroyed or scattered by Korthak battle groups that seemed to know exactly where to hit them. Admiral Yun Ji worked frantically to contact other Federation military commanders, but most of them were dealing with their own crisis situations and could not spare forces to help anyone else. The Terrellian Third Fleet had promised to send reinforcements, but they were tied up in political arguments with the Andorian Council about which species would have territorial rights to any systems they helped defend. By the time those negotiations were finished, there might not be any systems left to argue about because the Korthak advance was moving faster than anyone had expected. Within 72 hours, 8 Federation systems had fallen to Korthak forces, and the enemy was already moving toward new prosperity. which served as the central hub for trade throughout the region. Millions of Federation civilians fled in overcrowded refugee ships that had never been designed to carry so many people for extended periods through dangerous space. The evacuation efforts were hampered by the same communication problems that plagued military operations, as different species used incompatible emergency protocols. Korthak submarines attacked refugee convoys, knowing that Federation forces would have to divert ships from military operations to protect civilian vessels. This forced Federation commanders to choose between defending strategic targets and protecting innocent people who had done nothing to deserve being caught in a war zone. Admiral Ji-Wan monitored the situation from her flagship in human space beyond the Federation borders, where her people had been exiled by the very beings they had protected for decades. Human intelligence networks that had been built over years of cooperation. With Federation species provided real-time updates on the unfolding disaster, her staff officers watched Federation news broadcasts showing burning space stations and desperate evacuation efforts, while Federation politicians blamed each other for the security failures. Captain Dong Hyun approached the Admiral with tactical displays showing that human rapid response fleets could reach the Vega corridor within 18 hours if they ignored the ban. The human forces had been conducting training exercises near the Federation border, not because they expected to be invited back, but because they knew something like this would eventually happen. Human military doctrine emphasized being ready to respond to threats even when politicians made decisions that created dangerous security gaps. Admiral Ji-Wan studied the tactical situation and calculated that 3 human battle groups could stop the Korthak advance and possibly recapture some of the lost systems, but that would require violating the ban that 847 different species had voted for just months earlier when they decided humans were too dangerous for civilized space. Captain Dong Hyun pointed out that Federation civilians were dying while their governments argued about jurisdiction and resource allocation. The Admiral's expression remained calm, but her officers could see the anger in her eyes as she watched Federation forces fail to protect their own people. She had spent decades serving alongside Federation officers and fighting to protect Federation civilians from pirates, slavers, and other threats. Now those same civilians were suffering because their leaders had chosen prejudice over practical security considerations. The human fleet commanders were requesting permission to intervene, but Admiral Ji-Wan held them back because she understood the larger principles at stake. If humans violated the ban, even to save lives, it would prove Federation claims that humans could not be trusted to follow civilized rules and diplomatic agreements. The Federation needed to learn the full cost of their decision before they would be willing to admit they had made a mistake. Reports continued coming in, showing Korthak forces advancing toward core Federation worlds, while defense coordinators struggled to mount any effective resistance. The enemy was using human tactical manuals they had captured or stolen over the years, but the Federation forces had no experience fighting against those same tactics. Korthak battle. Groups appeared where they were not expected, hit targets that seemed impossible to reach, and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. This was exactly the kind of warfare that humans had perfected during decades of fighting pirates and other enemies across vast distances of Space Federation military academies had studied human tactics, but they had dismissed them as crude and unsuitable for civilized warfare between advanced species. Now they were learning that effectiveness mattered more than elegance when real enemies were trying to kill you and capture your territory. The Korthak advance continued relentlessly as Federation forces discovered that their advanced technology meant nothing without the training and experience needed to use it properly. General Kang Min's forces had studied Federation capabilities for years and knew exactly how to neutralize their advantages while exploiting their weaknesses. Within a week, the strategic situation had become a complete rout, with Korthak forces controlling 17 systems and showing no signs of slowing. Their advanced Federation member worlds began questioning whether their governments could actually protect them or if they needed to negotiate separate peace agreements with the Korthak. The unity that had seemed so strong when they voted to ban humans was falling apart under the pressure of a real military threat that their forces could not handle. Admiral Ji-Wan received increasingly desperate messages from Federation commanders asking for human assistance, but she did not respond to any of them. The Federation had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences until they were ready to admit they had been wrong about humans. 3 weeks into the Korthak invasion, the strategic situation had become a complete disaster for the Federation, as enemy forces now controlled 17 systems and were preparing to assault Sanctuary, which fed 40 billion Federation citizens. Massive agricultural world produced food supplies that were shipped to dozens of core worlds, and its loss would create famine conditions across large portions of Federation space refugee camps throughout the remaining Federation territory strained. Under the weight of millions of displaced people who had fled the advancing Korthak armies with whatever possessions they could carry. The camps lacked adequate medical supplies, food distribution systems, and basic sanitation facilities because no one had planned for refugee populations of this size. Federation member governments began receiving angry messages from their own citizens, demanding to know why their advanced militaries were being defeated by what they had been told were primitive. Aggressors Council Speaker Haya Jin found herself facing questions she could not answer about why Federation forces seemed completely unable to stop an enemy that humans had contained for decades. The crystalline Vorthan's usual calm authority was replaced by obvious stress as she tried to maintain order during emergency council sessions where delegates blamed each other for the crisis. In closed meetings away from public scrutiny, Federation leaders finally began discussing the possibility of asking humans for military assistance despite the ban they had imposed. The conversations were painful and humiliating for species that had spent months condemning human military methods as brutal and unsuitable for civilized beings. Ambassador Hyun-woo, who had led the campaign against humans, now found himself trying to explain to his constituents why their superior Zilithian military strategies were failing so badly. His government was receiving casualty reports that showed Zilithian forces being systematically destroyed by Korthak tactics that seemed designed specifically to counter Federation doctrine. The Zilithian military had been built around the assumption that advanced technology and superior firepower would always defeat primitive aggression and numerical superiority. Korthak forces proved that assumption wrong by using speed, mobility, and concentrated attacks to overwhelm Federation defenders before they could bring their technological advantages to bear. Delegate Minna of the Korvani Empire argued that requesting human assistance would be a devastating blow to Federation credibility throughout the galaxy. She pointed out that they had told their people that humans were dangerous monsters who threatened galactic peace and could not be trusted around civilized species. Now they would have to admit that those same monsters were the only ones capable of defending Federation territory against real military threats. The political implications were staggering, because it would prove that the Federation had based their most important security decision on prejudice rather than facts. Military Coordinator Wu Jin presented tactical analyses showing that current Federation defensive capabilities could delay the inevitable for perhaps 2 weeks at most. His projections indicated that Korthak forces would capture Sanctuary within days, unless something dramatic changed the strategic balance. The refugee evacuation from Sanctuary had already begun, but the planet's population was too large to move quickly, especially with Korthak submarines attacking transport convoys. Even if every available Federation ship was used for evacuation duty, they could only save a small fraction of the civilian population before the planet fell. The debate in the council chambers grew heated as delegates struggled with the choice between swallowing their pride and watching billions of innocent people die. Some species argued that asking for human help would set a dangerous precedent that encouraged other banned or restricted groups to ignore Federation decisions. Others pointed out that the Federation would not exist much longer if they could not protect their own territory from aggressive neighbors like the Korthak. The vote to formally request human military assistance passed by the narrowest possible margin, with 424 delegates in favor and 422 opposed. Several delegates abstained rather than take a public position that their constituents might use against them in future elections. Ambassador Hyun-woo was selected to deliver the message to Admiral Ji-won because he had been the most vocal advocate for the ban, and his participation would carry symbolic weight. The meeting was arranged in neutral space aboard a small diplomatic vessel that belonged to a species that had remained neutral throughout the crisis. Hyun-woo arrived with a small staff of advisors, but Admiral Ji-won came alone, which seemed to emphasize the difference in their positions. The Zilithian ambassador's usual arrogance had been replaced by barely concealed desperation as he tried to find words that would not completely humiliate his government. He explained that the situation had evolved beyond their initial projections and that Federation forces were facing challenges they had not anticipated. The request for temporary human military assistance was phrased as a mutual cooperation agreement rather than an admission that the Federation needed rescue Admiral. Ji-won listened to his carefully prepared speech without showing any emotion on her weathered face that had seen too many political betrayals over the years. When Hyun-woo finished his presentation, she asked only one question that cut through all, the diplomatic language to the heart of the matter. She wanted to know why humans should violate the ban that Federation species had voted for when they decided human military presence was too dangerous for civilized space. The question hung in the air like a physical weight as Hyun-woo struggled to formulate an answer that would not admit his government had been completely wrong. He tried to explain that circumstances had changed and that new information had become available about the nature of the threats facing Federation territory. Admiral Ji-won pointed out that the threats had not changed at all and that humans had been warning about exactly this kind of situation for years. The Korthak had always been aggressive expansionists held in check only by the knowledge that human rapid response fleets would intervene if they attacked Federation territory. Federation intelligence services had provided detailed reports about Korthak military capabilities and their obvious preparations for a major offensive campaign. Those reports had been ignored or dismissed by Federation leaders who preferred to believe that diplomatic pressure would be sufficient to maintain peace. Now they were learning that diplomacy only worked when backed by credible military force capable of making aggression too costly. To attempt, Hyun-woo admitted that perhaps they had underestimated the importance of human military contributions to galactic security, but he stopped short of accepting full responsibility, tried to frame the request as an opportunity for humans to demonstrate their commitment to peace and their willingness to forgive past misunderstandings. Admiral Ji-won's response was quiet but firm, as she told him that humans had already demonstrated those qualities by protecting Federation citizens for decades without recognition. The Federation had repaid that protection by voting to ban human military vessels and condemning human soldiers as dangerous primitives unfit for civilized society. Before she would consider violating the ban, Admiral Ji-won said there were some things the Federation leadership needed to understand about what they had actually voted against. She activated a holographic display system and told Hyun-woo that he was about to see exactly what human brutality really looked like when it was used to protect innocent lives. The ambassador settled back in his chair, expecting to see more evidence of human military aggression. But what appeared on the display was something completely different. What he saw would change everything. He thought he knew about humans and force him to confront the reality of what his people had thrown away when they voted for the ban. Admiral Ji-won activated the holographic display, and the small diplomatic vessel's conference room filled with images that Ambassador Hyun-woo had never seen in any official Federation reports. The video began with footage from the Battle of Kepler's Edge, which had occurred 2 years before the ban, but Federation records listed it simply as a minor pirate action with few casualties. What appeared on the display showed a completely different reality that had been hidden from Federation leaders, who preferred sanitized reports over uncomfortable truths. A Thrixie colony ship called Peaceful Dawn carried 50,000 civilian refugees from a plague-ravaged world as it traveled slowly through space toward a new home. The massive vessel was overloaded with families who had lost everything and were desperately seeking safety in Federation territory, where they believed they would be protected. Pursuing them was a pack of Ravager-class vessels operated by the Crimson Syndicate, which had been terrorizing the outer systems for months without any effective resistance. The Syndicate ships were massive predators designed for capturing civilian vessels and processing their passengers for sale in the slave markets that operated beyond. Federation Borders Admiral Ji-won's voice was calm as she explained that Federation intelligence had classified this as a minor pirate raid. Despite knowing the true nature of the threat, the Syndicate had acquired military-grade weapons and was specifically targeting refugee ships because desperate civilians brought higher prices from buyers who preferred broken spirits. The footage showed a single Zilithian patrol cruiser arriving 12 hours after the distress call only to retreat immediately when its captain saw the size of the enemy fleet. Yun Wu watched in horror as the Thrixie vessel's shields failed under sustained bombardment from weapons that were illegal under Federation law but readily available in criminal markets. Video captured the moment when Syndicate boarding clamps breached the civilian ship's hull and armed raiders began pouring into corridors filled with terrified families. Then something unexpected happened that changed the entire nature of the engagement. As new contacts appeared on the tactical display, Captain Sung Min of the human destroyer Righteous Fury had been conducting routine patrol operations 3 systems away when they intercepted the refugees' distress call. Despite being outnumbered 6-1, the human vessel immediately jumped to intercept without waiting for reinforcements or requesting permission from higher command. What followed defied every principle of conventional military doctrine that Federation academies taught their officers about proper engagement procedures. The Righteous Fury used micro-jumps to appear directly inside the enemy formation, where no sane commander would voluntarily place their ship at ramming speed. The human destroyer struck one of the Ravager vessels while her crew teleported to safety at the last possible second. Captain Sung Min led a boarding party that cut through 3 enemy ships using nothing but handheld weapons and tactics that other species called suicidal. The video showed human Marines fighting in zero gravity with a ferocity that made Hyunwoo uncomfortable as they carved their way through the Syndicate forces. Admiral Ji-won explained that every human vessel carried soldiers trained specifically for close quarters combat in hostile environments where normal tactics would fail. When pirates took hostages, humans did not negotiate or try to minimize casualties among the criminals. They simply boarded the enemy ships and took their people back. The battle ended, with 5 Ravager vessels destroyed and the 6th captured along with its crew who were detained for trial under Federation law. More importantly, every single Thrixie refugee survived the encounter because human forces had prioritized protecting civilians over their own safety. The total engagement time was 14 minutes with 8 humans wounded, but none killed, while 50,000 innocent lives were saved. Admiral Ji-won showed another video file documenting the siege of Fornax Station, where human engineers held off a Korthak assault for 6 days using improvised weapons. The defenders had no hope of victory, but they refused evacuation until every non-human civilian had been safely removed from the station. A third video showed the rescue at Vega 7, where human medics walked through active combat zones to treat wounded aliens while refusing medical attention for themselves. The pattern was clear in every engagement as humans consistently put the lives of other species above their own survival and comfort. This was what the Federation had voted against when they decided human military methods were too brutal for civilized space. Hyunwoo stared at the displays with his blue-scaled face pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his people's mistake. These were not the actions of primitive monsters, but of beings who considered protection of civilians to be worth dying for. Regardless of species, Admiral Ji-won's voice was cold as she pointed out that Federation reports had deliberately hidden these facts to avoid admitting how much they depended on human sacrifice. The sanitized versions made it sound like humans were aggressive troublemakers when they were actually the only species willing to pay the real cost of protecting others. She asked Hyunwoo if he understood what they had called brutality when humans were simply doing what needed to be done to save innocent lives. The ambassador could barely speak as he admitted that his people had been wrong about humans and had made a terrible mistake. Admiral Ji-won agreed that they had been wrong, but pointed out that the real question was whether they were willing to admit that publicly. The Federation could continue trying to handle the Korthak situation themselves, or they could acknowledge that some problems required solutions they were not prepared to accept. Hyunwoo requested permission to transmit the video footage to the full Galactic Council so other delegates could see what they had actually voted against. Within hours, the same assembly hall that had voted to ban human military vessels became the site of an emergency session where everything changed. Delegate after delegate stood to formally apologize for their misjudgment. As they watched the evidence of human sacrifice on behalf of other species, the footage showed clearly that human brutality was actually principled protection of those who could not protect themselves. The ban was lifted by unanimous vote before the session ended, and human fleets were already moving toward the Vega corridor Admiral Junho of the Korthak fleet received word that human vessels had been detected at the edge of Sanctuary System. His immediate orders to withdraw all forces and open communications for surrender negotiations proved that even humanity's enemies understood their military capabilities. The Korthak had been willing to fight Federation forces, but they had no desire to face humans who fought like the universe, depended on their victory. The war ended, not with massive battles, but with the simple knowledge that humans were coming to restore order. Federation citizens welcomed their former protectors with gratitude and shame as they realized what they had almost lost through prejudice and fear. The humans accepted their thanks quietly and went back to work, protecting others without demanding apologies or recognition for their sacrifices. In the end, the galaxy learned that true strength was not about advanced technology or superior firepower, but about the willingness to put others before yourself. The Federation had mocked humans for their primitive dedication to protecting civilians, but that dedication proved to be the most advanced military. Doctrine of all peace returned to the Vega corridor, not because diplomacy had solved the crisis, but because everyone knew that humans would fight to protect the innocent. The lesson was simple but profound as species across the galaxy finally understood that civilization was not about avoiding violence, but about using it only to protect those who could not protect themselves.